Okay, so I want to go over a little more detail on the balance scorecard paper that you have to do for week 7. And to start off with, you want to go to industry scoring and then balance scorecard and overall company assessment. Now I can see all the teams balance scorecard, but you probably only see your own for your own team. I'm going to look at Team Chester. As I said in the some guidance that I gave you, that you should have an introduction, an overview and history of the balance scorecard, and then a write-up for every single section of the balance scorecard: the financial, customer perspective, learning, growth, and internal processes, and then a conclusion for the weekly scores. So because these scores change every week, you're going to have to figure out a way of synthesizing that information and showing trends. Here I'm going to show you an approach that would use a graph for that. So for example, look at Team Chester, for example. When I go to round 1 here, if I was doing the financial section of the paper, I would see that I have 3 metrics that are 3 key performance indicators: stock price, profits, and leverage. If you look here, you see that these are all on a score on a scale of 8 or 9, which is pretty close. So you could put all these on the same graph without losing any real information. I would use a graph for this. What I would do is I would go for each round, I would have a column for stock price, profit, one for profits, and another for leverage for the 8 simulations that you did. And this just shows what it is for week 1 right here. If this is for Chester, okay? So what I did here was I had round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I went through for profits through every week. So you can see that in round 1 for financial, for profits, Chester had 3.8 out of 9, and that was what I put here, 3.8. And then I went to round 2 for Chester and found they had 8.1 out of 9. So I put 8.1 here. Then for the remaining weeks, they pulled zeros, which I could have read off here, but in week 7 they got a 0.6 and then 0 again. Okay? So what I've done here is I have gone every week for each metric in the financial section and put it into columns here in a spreadsheet format. Then what I did was I highlighted this whole thing. Because these are on generally the same scale of about 1 to 8, 1 to 9, they could all go on the same graph with too much clutter. If you have any more than 3 metrics on a graph, I would say that you should split it into 2 graphs. Or if the scales don't line up, if they're not all on the same scale roughly, then I would split them into figures that have different scales, so that the scales match each other. So what I do is I go Insert, click on 2D column, and you can see that it's given me this chart here. What I have to do now is right click on the outer border, go to Select Data, and get rid of the round measures and click on OK. So uncheck round, click on OK. And I think I did use the wrong graph. I wanted a line graph. Insert, line graph. There we go. Right click, select data, and get rid of the round checkbox. You see? That gives me this graph right here. And I can see that, it tells is the similar story. If in rounds 1 to 3 there was, at least 1 and 2 there was some decent scoring going on here. But then when we got into rounds 3 and 4, then they didn't get many scores at all for each of these values, and there was a bit of a peak in week 7 and then below, and then it went back to 0 again. So I could talk about every single one of these individual lines. Like the orange is the profit along here, the yellow is the stock price, and the leverage is the gray bar. If you see nothing along the bottom, only one color, that means all the colors are at the bottom, and I guess the yellow one was last, so that's the one that you see the most. Put a title on it. Put the axes titles on it as well, so that you end up with something that looks like this. This is what I would put in the financial section as an APA formatted figure, and then I would give the analysis of how the team did based on on that graph. That would be a very effective way of presenting the information in the balanced scorecard. Now, something else that will help you, if I go back here, if you click on each of these metrics, it tells you where your metrics needed to be to get various scores. So for example, on stock price, you can see that if your stock price was less than or equal to 1, then you got no credit. If it's between 1 and $32, you got partial credit. And if it was greater than 32, you got full credit. This is a moving target. You'll find that the numbers change on some metrics. So let's go to round 6 here and go to stock price. See how now it goes less than $2, no credit. 2 to $62 is partial credit, and then greater than 62 is full credit. So these are moving targets, but they should give you some idea of interpreting how you did over time on stock price. So when I go back to this diagram here for stock price, which is yellow, we can see where they did pretty well, almost perfect scores in round 1 and 2. Then as their stock price started falling, it fell to a little less than 2 for their balanced scorecard score, and then it was pretty much 0 for the rest of the simulation because their stock price was less than the minimum value. Okay, so that's how I would go about analyzing the balanced scorecard. If I was doing internal business processes, I would put contribution, plant utilization, and days of working capital. I would put those all on one graph, and then I'd have a separate graph for stockouts and inventory carrying costs. These are all on the same scale, so you could conceivably put them all on the same graph, but 5 line charts is too much if it gets too cluttered. So I would split it into one for these 3 items, and then I would have another graph for stockout and inventory carrying costs as well. I can't seem to select that the way I want, but stockout and inventory carry costs would be on their own graph. And I would split these guys out as well. So there's a bit of work here in doing the graphing, but if you split it in your team, it shouldn't be too bad.